come from you.
Hi, welcome to Your Next Door Neighbor. This week we have for you Chemin Bernard. Rich?
Chemin Bernard is an incredible story, journey. I've known Chemin since 1990. She was a casting director and became the president of the Casting Director Association in America.
Female casting director in Hollywood.
Yes.
African American female.
And the trials and tribulations of what that all takes in.
Getting through the 80s.
And 90s.
And 90s. Trials and tribulations for everybody. But even more for her.
And then after that, she has moved on and started a prisoner rehabilitation program that, you'll have to hear it.
Yeah, you will. Chemin Bernard.
Enjoy the show. What's your name?
Chemin Bernard.
And where were you born?
Washington, D.C.
And I know you moved from Washington to Los Angeles. How old were you when you moved?
Well, I moved from Washington to Chicago to Fresno to Los Angeles and back and forth in between all those places as a kid.
Wow.
Yeah.
And your parents, where were they from?
So my mother was from Chicago. My dad was born in Moline, Illinois. So, but they were in D.C. because my mom was in Howard when I was born.
So that was after World War II?
Yeah. Dad was in the Navy and came out and went into engineering and a whole bunch of other stuff.
And what was your mom's degree in?
She was, she had I don't know what her bachelor's was in, but when I was born, she was going into law school. And she actually tried to go back when I was about 4 years old, but, it was just too much to try to do it and have a kid. So she moved back to Chicago.
And why were you moving around? Why did you guys move around?
My parents moved, mostly for my dad's jobs. My dad was like a Renaissance guy, so he was a cab driver. He was always the first black whatever, so he was a cab driver in D.C. while he was going back to school and supporting my mom. And then in Chicago, he was an engineer. Then we moved to Quincy, California when I was 8 so that he could be a forest ranger in the Sierra Nevadas. Then we moved down to Fresno because fighting fires up in Quincy in the Sierra Nevadas wasn't fun for him. So we moved down to Fresno, and then my mom and I moved back to Chicago because she had it with California.
So you grew up for a period of time in the Sierra Nevadas?
6 months. We were there from like August until, like February. I think we moved right after Christmas. Yeah, it was in the 50s, and my father was, what I know now is he was really challenged by being the only black forest fighter, firefighter up there in the wood, out for days at a time fighting forest fires, and they were really hazing him, and making his life difficult. And my mom didn't help because she spoke her mind. And in that town, this little bitty town we were in, black people didn't do that. And so I learned when I was an adult that my mom had closed a restaurant for not serving us, and my dad's co-workers just completely challenged and hazed him about how come you can't keep your woman in line. And yeah, it was like that. So they moved to Fresno for 6 more months, and then my mom was like, and I'm out. And so she took me and went back to Chicago to her mom. And my dad stayed in Fresno. So then I became, the kid that went between her two parents.
And Chicago, 60s?
So I was living in Chicago from 58 to 59, 60, from 60 till 62-ish. But I call Chicago home.
Why is that?
Because it was the city that I resonated most with, and it's the city I was in the most. We were only in California for a year, really, between Quincy and Fresno. So I call Chicago home because I started living there when I was like 5 years old. And every time we would go anywhere, we would end up back in Chicago. And I love the city. I just love the city. So I lived there off and on between my two parents until my son was born. Then I finally moved out here for good when he was 4. But Chicago was always home.
How old were you then?
I was 23 when I moved here. My son was, so he wasn't 4, he was almost 5.
So where in Chicago were you living?
South Side. There's only one side. There's South Side, please.
I'm not from Chicago. He is.
Really? You probably told me that a long time ago. But yeah, I'm from the South Side. I went to Harlan.
That's the high school?
Uh-huh. In Chicago, you identify by what high school you went to.
Yeah, of course. And then you went to college,
So I moved out here to go to college
which was?
because when I was in Chicago working at the phone company raising my kid, I learned from a coworker that you could live in California and go to college for free, and I had never been. You know, I had my son when I was a teenager, so I had never been to college. And so I literally moved here for two reasons. One, to go to college, and two, and more importantly, because it snowed in June that year, in '72. And I was like, I can't be in a city where it snows in June. So I put in for a transfer.
Were you working with Ma Bell back then?
Yeah, I was a customer service rep with with Illinois Bell, and really doing well. I was like on a management track, but I just couldn't. I wanted to create a life for myself and my kid that was more than that, and I didn't know what that more was. But I just knew that there was something. There was something else, and I wanted to be warm.
Yeah, don't we all? That's why we're here. Didn't you? So did you move back with your father, Sacramento way, Fresno way, or?
Dad by then had moved to Vegas, of all places. Yeah, he lived in Vegas, and so we stopped in Vegas on the way here. And originally, my dad was going to keep Danny while I came on down here, and I had transferred to Packville here. But my dad wasn't able to keep him, so I ended up resigning from the phone company and staying in Vegas for 3 months. The most toxic experience I've ever had. And
Why's that?
because Vegas this was in the early 70s, and in those days, 74, 73, and in those days, Vegas for African American people was a pit. The best that you could hope for was to be a pit boss, and most of the time they thought you could be a maid, or if you were really smart, maybe you could train to be a dealer if you were really lucky. But most of the time they thought prostitution was a viable option. And I lived there for 3 months, and I learned, who was actually running the city, and it was too much for me. And I just said, you know what, I'm going to take my chances. And I sent Danny back to live with my mom and my grandparents, and I moved here not knowing anybody. I just left.
And where was the first place you?
I slept on somebody's couch that was a friend of my co-workers in Vegas. I literally couch hopped until, and I got a job at the Broadway, what was the Broadway then. And finally got enough money together to get an apartment and save up, and then I brought Danny out the next at the end of that year.
Wow, that's a lot of work.
I was determined. I sent him back in what must have been like around September, because I was in Vegas for 3 years, so 3 months, so April to whatever that was. And then I moved down here, so it took me until like June of the next year to get settled and get a place, which ironically was right over here, right down from this neighborhood, right on Slauson and Fairfax.
And what did you first start doing when you were here, when you moved here?
When I first moved here, I worked for the Broadway. Then I got a job with Pac Bell, because even though I had resigned, and when I stayed in Vegas, I was an experienced customer service rep, so they hired me back. But I lost all my seniority and everything. But they hired me, so I worked out in the Imperial Highway in Western. I worked there, and I immediately became a union organizer, because the first week I was working there, they told me, you have to come in 5 minutes early before your start time, and we don't pay you, and you have to stay until the last call you're on is over, and we don't pay you. And I was like, I'm from Chicago, what are you talking about? And so I found a union and got in touch with one of the organizers, and I literally became Norma Ray, and I organized the commercial department down here for the first time.
Well, if you're saying you're like Norma Ray, there must have been resistance. There must have been people who thought you were a troublemaker, leave them alone.
Absolutely. I was put on probation within a month of starting to organize. And the woman that was supposed to be organizing with me got scared, and they offered her a transfer in a different department, and she took it. So I was left alone. But my parents raised me to see through what you start. And I was determined, because I knew that these women didn't understand that they had options. And I was really, the irony of all this is that I was extremely shy and very introverted in those days. But what I learned is that I could talk to people one-on-one, and I could say to them, I worked in Illinois, and this is how we were treated. And you guys are being treated this way, and you don't have to be if you have a union behind you.
So what ultimately happened?
We won. And we converted.
Over what period of time did that take?
I'm thinking that it was over probably 6 months or more. I'm not sure. I know that we started, so I started there in 74. And by 75, we had unionized. So it was somewhere in that time. Because I literally had that moment of walking through the office with the sign, and this, I think it was before the movie, but whatever it was, I was like, I had done something I had never thought I was capable of. I had talked a whole office full of women into voting this in. And it was mind-boggling to me. And that's became the impetus for me to finally look for a college that I could go to and start to get my degree. That convinced me. So winning the union, what happened was I remembered why I had moved to California in the first place. And so I started calling colleges to see, by then I was 26, and I started calling colleges to see if anybody had any kind of program for older people coming to college, because I thought I was old. And I called UCLA, USC, and then I called Loyola Marymount. And the person connected me to a department called Encore that was for women, specifically women who had never been to college or had been gone a long time, and their program let you come back and take 2 courses a semester. You had a tutorial program. They taught you how to use the library. It was exactly what I was looking for, and you didn't have to take SATs, and you didn't have to do any of that. You could just come. And so I took 2 semesters of that program. And at the end of the second semester, my counselor, the head of the program, said, you should go think about going full time. You could get your degree, and our financial aid guy will help you, because you're really, like, I'd gotten all A's. It was like, because I loved it, and so I said, okay. I mean, it was, in those days I was fearless, so it was like, okay, I'll do that. And I said, what do I major in? And she said, well, what do you like? And she started listing things, and she said, English and science and this and that. And then she said, communication arts. And I was like, oh, I work for the phone company. I'll do that. Communication, that's what I do. And turns out that communication arts was film and television production. Who knew? But I loved it. From the moment I started that major, I loved it. And we had a African-American financial aid officer who made it his business. Larry Braxton made it his business to make sure that I got grants. I quit the phone. I went on leave from the phone company, because now that we were union, they couldn't mess with me because I was the union steward. So I got to take a leave of absence, and the phone company had this tuition reimbursement program. So I applied for that, and as I completed each semester, they had to pay for it, which just was aces. But my coworkers were horrified. And that was the first time I ever experienced people trying to pull you down, because they literally sat me in the break room and went, how dare you? What makes you think you can go to college? And what makes you think, you've got a kid to think about, and what are you going to do? And how are you going to pay for this? And, I mean, it was like being in a police interrogation room. They just needed the bright light.
That's ridiculous. That is thinking about your kid.
And how did you take that in?
I was like, this is what I have to do. The thing I've said about my life is I've always been blessed to know when something is for me. And when something is for me to do, I don't question it. And nobody can talk me out of it. And I knew that I was supposed to do this. I had no doubt. And so I went on welfare, and for 4 years I was on welfare, and I supported my kid, and I did work-study in between, semesters. And in the summers, I would go back and work at the phone company, because part of my leave of absence was that they had to give me a job. Wow. When I wasn't in school. So I would go back and work for them. But after my sophomore year, the phone company said, well, okay, you've gone for 2 years now. It's time for you to come back to work full time, because we've never had anybody go for 4 straight years, and we're not going to pay for that. And I was like, there's nothing in your paperwork that says that. And so I challenged them, and they fired me. And the union filed a grievance. And it went all the way to national. So meanwhile, I don't have that job to rely on. And so my junior year was tough, but they won the grievance, and they had to reinstate me, give me back my seniority. They even had to bridge the seniority from Illinois, and I kept on going, and I graduated.
You sound like such a revolutionary figure. No one else had done this before you.
No.
And so there's a lot of doing there, but what were you thinking as this was all going along? What was going through your mind? Were you...
That's a good question. You know, when I was younger, I kind of did things unconscious. Like I said, if it was something I thought I was supposed to do, I just ducked my head and did it. And the most important thing to me was keeping my son with me while I was doing all this. So the best advice I ever got was that while I was in school, one of my professors said, you have a wealth of experience because you've lived X amount of years longer than most of these kids that are, in these classes with you. So when you do your papers, write from your own personal experience. You had a father that was a civil rights activist. Write about that when you're doing sociology and history. And so that was the best advice I could have gotten. And so I kind of incorporated my life into my homework, and the professors loved it. So I wasn't really thinking anything except it was really about what's the next step, what's the next class, how am I going to manage in the summer, how am I going to take care of my kid, and in the summers my family would send for my son so that I could have a break and I could work, and by the time I was a junior, I was doing internships in the industry to see what I really wanted to do. I thought I was going to be a boom operator. I loved running the boom,
Wow.
And then it changed in my junior year. Everything changed in my junior year.
So were your parents supportive of this?
No.
I would think that from where they were coming from, somebody who goes on welfare, that's...
My mother was a social worker, and by that time my father was too. And my father was also, I learned later, much later, that my dad was also involved in building like low-income housing and all that in Fresno. He was still in Fresno at that point. Was he? No, he was in Vegas. Wherever he was, but he was involved in all that stuff. So neither one of them could understand why I would give up what they considered to be this perfect job, to go back to school. They just couldn't understand it. But both of them were college graduates, you know what I mean? In fact, my mom had gone back and gotten her master's at 40, and they were my role models, so I couldn't understand why they couldn't understand. And they both thought it was just some fad that I was doing that, I would fail. And so they refused to support me financially. The most they would do is my mom would send for my son every summer. But she would constantly berate me during the year about, why are you doing this? And, you're on welfare. It's scandalizing our family. And it's a shame. I mean, my mom really had an issue with it. My dad just kind of was like, yeah, you do that. Okay. So what I did is I created like a little village. My son and I were pretty out here by ourselves. But I had one of my friends from Chicago had moved here, so he became like my son's uncle and still is. He was like my brother. So he helped with Danny a lot. During the school year, he would, pick him up or he'd be home or whatever. And when I went back to school, I got roommates so that I could pay for the apartment and I wanted to keep Danny in the same school system. So it became really important to find a way financially to do that. So I took in roommates. And poor Danny had to give up his room so I could have the roommate in a private room. But, I tried to offset that with taking him to school with me and, taking him to events and things so he could understand what I was doing. Because my whole point to him was, I want to be a mom that you can be proud of. And so I'm doing this to better both of our lives. I want to do this.
At some point, did you just, weren't you tired?
My junior year was the roughest year, and it turned out also to be the best year. But in the beginning of my junior year, I didn't have a place to live. I was back to sleeping on couches, him and me. And at one point, I didn't have even the couch, so I would sneak back into the office of the man that I was working for at school, and I would sleep in the office after he'd left.
With Dan?
Mm-hmm. So I'd give Dan the couch and I'd sleep on the floor, and I don't even know if Dan remembers that. But I didn't have a place to live because my financial aid hadn't come through. The person that got me in the school had left, and whoever replaced him was only offering loans that I couldn't afford. So it was, like I was hanging on by a thread. And I lost the phone company job at that point. It was in arbitration, so I didn't know if I was going to get reimbursed my tuition. It was the hardest year, and my family was like, well, we told you not to do that, so no, we're not helping you.
So, but then you said it was also your best year.
Right. Well, ultimately, so I guess they must have won the arbitration case pretty quickly because when I started school, we were basically homeless, and somewhere in the middle of that year, I got an apartment, and it was still in his school district. And things started, and I got the work-study job. I had the work-study job. Things changed. But what happened is that I was in charge of producing a Black History Festival with my boss, who was the head of the African American Studies Department. So we were producing this Black Histories Festival, and my job was to put together a celebrity panel, right? And, again, only because I was majoring in communication arts. None of us knew anything about any of that. But I called and I got I think Bob Guillaume came, Chip Fields, Kim Fields, and I had invited the first Black agent, because by that time I thought, well, maybe I'll be an agent because all my friends are actors and I'll just help them get work. My friend Larry was like the penultimate example. It's like, he's so talented, why isn't he working? I'll go get a job where I can help him get work. Now I've got a degree, or I will have. So I invited the Black agent, and the day before the panel, I read an article in one of Larry's trades that was talking about this woman named Patty Hayes, who was the first Black casting director, female casting director ever. And she talked about what she did in this article, and it was like, if it was a cartoon, I would have clouds and birds fluttering and music. It was like, So on impulse, I called her and I invited her to come be on the panel. And I said, I want you to talk about what you do. And when she did the next day, I listened to her and I realized that agents are salesmen, but casting directors are the liaisons to the buyers. We don't have to make the final decision, but we get to funnel the talent in front of them. We're like the last stop before the decision makers. And I thought that was a great role. And so I asked her to mentor me. So she mentored me. And every day after school at Loyola in Westchester, I would drive to Universal Studios, and I would sit in her office after classes until she closed. And I would watch what she did, and I'd read all her forms, and I'd listen to her conversations, and she'd take me to workshops, and she really taught me what she did and how she did it. And, I decided that that's what I wanted to do. So she offered me a job, like maybe a month later, but I knew that if I took that job, I wouldn't finish school. So I declined it, but what I decided to do was start my own casting company at Loyola. And so I started offering myself to students that were making, films, and I would say, give me your script, I'll find your actors, I'll audition them for you, and I'll have them show up on your set.
For student films.
For student films. And so I could learn how to audition. And this is before cable. And so the trade-off was the actors would get a copy of the film, which they always wanted. They always wanted tape. And so that's what I started doing. I would put ads in Dramalog, and I would have actors come in, and I'd learn how to audition.
Dramalog. Is Dramalog still around?
Mm-mm.
What year was this?
This was 1978. Yeah. And so I built up notebooks of actors, and, I loved it. I had found my niche. I just loved every second of it. And by the time I was a senior and I did my senior film, I had one of the productions that was the most talked about for years. I had a cast of 11 actors. I had 3 sets. One of my sets was a tenement with walkways in between, and the actors would come out singing a cappella. It was bad. Not only that, but the day of the shoot, because by then I had made friends in the acting community, and the day of the shoot, one of my sound and my electrician person, who were students, bailed. So I called my actors to say, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to do this shoot. And one of them said, well, my boyfriend's an electrician. He works on Palmerstown, and his best friend is a sound guy. And they're not working today. I'll see if they can just come help you. And they did. The sound guy was Russell Williams, who ended up winning the Oscar for Dances with Wolves. Right?
Wow.
And so they were, and so the electrician, Gary, was up there stringing lights that day, and my professor, who was like the curmudgeon of the department, walks in, sees all this, and goes, what are you doing? I'm like, I got this. I got this, right? And he says something to the electrician whom he didn't know, and the guy looks down at him and says, I do this for a living, and I get paid well for it. I got this. Just wait. And nobody had ever talked to my professor that way, and he walked away. And the production was extraordinary. But that was the first time I had cast something for myself, and it was amazing.
And you directed too.
I directed it. I wrote it, directed it, and shot it.
Edited it?
No, because I was not good at editing, so I hired one of my friends to edit it for me. Done.
And this was in the days when it was film. It
Yeah.
wasn't digital.
Yeah, and that's why I knew I wasn't I would sit with her, but I wasn't going to even try that. I never mastered that machine. It was like, I'm not doing that. So I bartered. I did her student film, and she edited my film.
So you knew your limit.
Yeah, so I would cast for them, and I'd barter, casting for whatever they did.
So now you've graduated.
So I've graduated. So Loyola was like, "What? You're leaving? Who's going to cast the student films?" Because by now it had become a thing, right? I had cast maybe 100 student films in 2 years. So they offered me an office and a work-study budget and internship approval and a phone. And they said, if you will just hire students and train them to do what you do, then you can use this office to work out of while you go out in the world and make your name for yourself. And that's what I did. So it was called Sylvan Casting. And I would have students either do work study and get paid for working for me, or they would be interns and they would get class credit and they would learn how to cast. And then when I got jobs out in the industry, I would hire them to be my assistants. By then we had people calling us from UCLA and USC. They were like, "We hear you got somebody that does in-house casting. Can they do us?" And so I started sending my staff out to cast other projects. I kept Sylvan Casting going for 2 years, but the problem was I went to work for MTM back in its heyday, and I was working for, my boss was I was working as an assistant, so I was starting from the bottom, and my boss was casting Newhart and Remington Steele and Duck Factory, Jim Carrey's first project. And our boss,
Remington Steele though.
So our boss found out that I had this casting company at Loyola, and I wasn't working during the day, but when I was on my lunch hours, before and after work, I'd be working with the kids, right? And I'd go out there once a week. Well, she found that out and said, you're moonlighting, and you have to choose. Do you want to keep this job or do you want to keep that? And she made me close the company.
And then do?
But I was an assistant at MTM,
Oh, okay.
and that was all I was supposed to be.
And how long were you there for?
2 years.
And how was that experience?
It was one of the best experiences in some ways because of the show. At that time we had Hill Street Blues, St. Elsewhere, Remington Steele. We had the top, must-see TV shows going. I mean, LA Law, those are the shows that made me want to be a casting director. I wanted to cast those ensembles. So in that sense, what I was exposed to was excellence, but the challenge was in those days, there were very few African American people in casting. And so it was very difficult to learn what I needed to learn because most of my peers had come from either theater or they had been mentored up by somebody, and I had just kind of gotten the job. You know what I mean? And so it wasn't, it was hard. And, I knew I was not in trouble, but because of my whole civil rights, background and all that, I put up a Jesse Jackson for president thing on the bulletin board one day. That did not go over well. And then one day, an actor that I had cast in his first film walked in and I hugged him, and he went in to meet my boss. And when he came out, she was like, "How do you know Crispin?" And I said, "Well, I cast him in his first film." And she goes, "I'm always surprised when you know white actors." And I said, "I don't know many black actors, actually. I only know..." And I realized in that moment that there was this disconnect in our business. There was a presumption that because I looked the way I looked, that I was only able to cast certain things, which had not been my experience. As a student film casting person, I did everything. But somehow in that business, it was perceived that I could only do things with people of color. And I didn't really believe that was going to be true. But as the years progressed, it became evident that that was a very shared perception.
So
Perception or prejudice, do you think?
Well, I don't know that I would call it a prejudice because I don't think it was that conscious. I would go on meetings for network executives, and this one in particular said, "Well, you have a strong resume, a lot of good credits, but we don't have any black projects." Now, my credits were not black shows. I had worked for MTM. I had worked for Carsey Warner. I'd work for, all the shows I'd worked on were not black shows. They didn't have them in those days.
Right.
But she was like, we don't have any black shows, so there's nothing I can really pitch you for. Actually, after the 2 years, the reason I left is because they said, we don't, we know that you're ready to move up to associate, but we don't really have any projects coming through that you would be right for. So we feel like we need to let you go on out and see if you can find something else. And I knew that I did good work. They were happy with my work as an assistant, but they didn't see me as someone that they wanted to groom for the next level, and in those days I didn't know where to put that.
And did you think that was because you were African American?
At the time I didn't, but I realize now that it had a lot to do with it. And it's not, these were good people. It was, well, I'm not trying to defend them, but I'm just saying what I've learned is that people want people around them that are comfortable and familiar.
Culture.
And so, for instance, the person that cast Hill Street Blues at the time always hired Jewish assistants. Because she said, I want people that I can speak shorthand with. I don't want to have to explain anything. I want to be comfortable. I want them to understand me. But there weren't black casting directors. Like Patty left the business the year that I came in, and never worked again, right? And Reuben Cannon was there, but he was, off being Reuben Cannon. So there wasn't anyone to mentor us, those of us that were coming up, like me, Robbie Reed, Monica Swan. We all had to kind of hard scrabble to find our way. Because there was this perception. And it wasn't, we were aware of it, but they weren't. And now I think they would have a better understanding based on how the world is now. They'd have a better understanding of the things they said and how it landed, but I don't think in those days they even realized. She thought she was paying me a compliment when she said, I'm surprised when you know white actors. Yeah, and when I left, my boss, who didn't think I knew white actors, said, I don't know that you're cut out for this. I just don't know if you're right for this. She took me to lunch and said, maybe you should think about doing something else. And that was devastating. That's a moment I remember.
Was that her opinion of your work, or was that a commentary on the industry at the time?
It was her opinion of me as a person. She didn't think I had what it took to be a casting director. And it was devastating, because I loved MTM. I mean, MTM was my must-see TV. Everything that they produced, I loved. And to have been there for 2 years, it was like, answered prayer for me on a lot of levels. But to have her say that, I really kind of took it in as, I'm just not good enough. I've done all this work, and I've given up all this stuff, and I'm not good enough.
Psychologically devastating there.
It was devastating.
So you
overcame that?
Yeah, I did. And I mean, what I did is,
how did you overcome it?
I did little independent projects, and I was really blessed because one of the people that worked at Breakdown Services was like my de facto agent. So whenever he would hear of a job where somebody was looking for an associate or an assistant, he would recommend me. And so that's how I kind of kept afloat in that interim. And, it's all kind of blurry now because that was like 76 or 77, but I ended up going and working temp outside the industry for a long time. Like I had long-term temp jobs that I would take because, I had to work, I had to eat, I had to pay my rent. But it was long periods where I didn't work in casting at all. And so no, it wasn't 70s, it was in the 80s. So, but somewhere in there I got hired by a black casting directing team that was coming up, and they did Hollywood Shuffle. So I got to work for them, and that was Jackie Brown and Tony Livingston, and that was good. So I had these interim, periods where I got to work for someone, and so it became more of working for black people that were independent, that were kind of making their way. And from Jackie and Tony, I went to work for Robbie Reed, who had just been doing Different World, I think. And then she got Harlem Nights, and she hired me as her associate. And so we got to cast that, and that was my first big studio film working as an associate. I had done independent films, low budget stuff, but this was my first official film. And, it was such a fun shoot for us, It was just fun. It was fun.
So now you're on the path, so to speak.
Yeah.
So how much longer before you start?
So that was like 87, 88, And then a year later, I actually got my first television series as a full casting director.
What show was that?
Thanks to Robbie, actually. She had recommended me to the producer who saw my resume and said, you know, you could cast this. And so he hired me to cast it, the pilot. And I stayed on that series for, I guess, we did the pilot and then we did a year
What
of
show
the
was
series.
that?
It was called True Colors. It was Frankie Faison and Stephanie Faracy were married. And so they blended their families, but it was a black family and a white family. And it was about the culture differences. And Nancy Walker was the grandma. And I'm really proud of that cast because Bridget Brana now is like this wonderful, incredible actor, but she was the 16-year-old girl, the daughter of Stephanie Faracy. Stephanie Faracy has become a friend who works with me in my prison work. But so that was very life-changing for me, and I worked with that producer, that exec, for like 2 years. We did another pilot and something else, and then everything got canceled. But by that time I was on a track, I was on a track to, as a full casting director, and so I got work.
So what's your when you're casting? I know every movie's different, but what are you looking for? Is there an essence that is consistent through the industry that you're looking for, and what would that be?
So for me, and this isn't for all the casting directors, but for me, I look for authenticity. It's like when actors come into audition, I'm really looking for them to bring that role to life authentically. I want to forget that it's an actor. I want to be in that conversation with that person. I look for their ability to act in the silence so they don't just go dead between lines. I look for their own take on the character. I mean, I have never wanted to be an actor, but I took acting classes when I was at Loyola so I could learn what I was looking for.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Right. So, but I suck at it. So, but what I love is that actors have this magic. When they bring a character to life, I'm enthralled. And I learned very early on when I was a full casting director that I always needed to have somebody else read with them, because I would get so engrossed in what they were doing that I would forget that I was reading. And I was like, what are you going to say next? I love actors. I love what they do. It's magic to me. So I look for someone that makes me feel that way. And I look for people who can deliver a 1-line or 2-line part so effectively that they could be paired with a Tom Hanks or with a star, and they would match energy, And that's a skill that actors don't realize they need to have. The 2-line parts with the star, the nurse that walks up, we have to match energy and talent. And so they have to be as strong in those 2 lines as they would be in the lead. So I look for actors that can do that. And I was taught to always cast above the material. So if it's a 1-line part, I would cast people that normally did co-stars. If it was a co-star, I'd cast people that normally did guest stars, and so on. That's one of the things I learned at MTM, is to cast above the material.
Okay, so now you have your business and you're starting to do the shows and you're doing films and...
But I am now in sitcom land, because now, thanks to the Cosby Show, there are lots of black shows, and Fox is debuting. So there's Martin and all those shows, and that's what we all got, all of us, Robbie, me, all of us kind of got locked into being called for those things. We
Prince
didn't,
of Bel-Air.
all of it. We didn't get called for the big stuff. We didn't get called for the 1-hour dramas. We got called for the sitcoms.
Which was more consistent work anyways.
It was more consistent work, but remember, I came into this business inspired by the work done at MTM. I came into this business wanting to cast 1-hour dramas, wanting to cast ensembles that were diverse and interesting, and to be told that all I could do was cast black sitcoms was, at first it was fine, but then when it got to the point where that's all I was told I could do, it was really disappointing. And so I began to train my staff that because I always had a training office with interns, and I would train them that don't lock into this. Work for other casting directors that are doing white shows, that are doing 1 hours, whatever, so that you have a bigger scope of a body of work than just the black shows, And some of my peers got to do the high-end black shows. Like one of my friends was casting all John Singleton's, stuff, and Robbie Reed was doing all of Spike Lee's things, but I never actually got that hook in with a director, and so I didn't get to have that either. So it was all the television stuff, and the films that I did were great. I mean, I got to do Deep Cover with Lawrence Fishburne and work for Bill Duke. I got to cast Biker Boys, which is still one of the thrills of my career. I discovered I have an inner biker chick. So,
I don't know that movie.
oh, it's so good. It's such a good cast. Because I love ensembles, right? And it's an ensemble, so it's Terrence Howard, it's Lisa Bonet, it's there's a whole bunch of other people whose names I can see all their faces, but it's Kid Rock. I mean, we had, and I was hired with by Kim Harden to cast it with her, but I got to put that cast together, and it was just extraordinary.
Are you concerned when you're casting how people get along, or is that not your concern?
It is a concern because I am, casting directors are held accountable for what shows up on that set. Mm-hmm. So if I hire someone who's a real idiot on the set, they don't get mad at the actor, they just fire him. But the next call they make is to me to go, why would you put that guy on our set?
Right.
And I'm like, well, you picked him in the auditions, but okay.
So you're expecting
Yeah,
that.
but that's, you pass that responsibility down, they get angry at you for that.
They do.
They're like, well, why'd you let me pick them?
That's I've actually had a producer say that to me. I was
Shouldn't you
like,
have known
I
better?
tried to say to you that he has some issues, and you were like, I don't care, I can handle it.
At some point, and it might have been parallel to all this, you start getting involved with the Agape. Am I saying it right?
Yeah, I was actually involved with Agape from the very beginning.
Which
I'm a
was?
charter member, so that was 1986. Agape started a month before my husband and I got married.
And explain Agape to me.
Agape International Spiritual Center is a non-denominational organization. You can call it a church, but it really espouses metaphysical principles. And it originated under the banner of the religious science movement. So it was a religious science church when it started, not to be confused with Scientology. And those tenets really served me well personally in navigating this industry. But we are charter members because we knew our minister before he even became a minister.
Right.
He was one of my running buddies. So we've been there from the beginning. And so when I was working my way up through the industry, I was also, volunteering at Agape and, doing that, and that provided kind of a balance.
Because you're a facilitator.
Now,
And,
yeah.
and I don't know, what does that mean?
So over the years, as Agape grew, I took training to become a licensed practitioner, which is like a spiritual counselor. And the intention of that is that the practitioners service the congregation because not everybody can see Reverend Michael or whoever the minister is, and so practitioners serve as the ministerial arm of the church, and our job is to have counseling sessions with the congregants. They come and meet with us. We help them learn how to apply the principles to their day-to-day lives, and so I've been doing that since 1996. I was licensed in 1996, but out of that, I started to grow in that work in terms of being of service in that environment. So I started being one of the facilitators of the classes that people had to take to get to the licensing training. And then in recent years, I became one of the facilitators for the actual practitioner training.
You said licensing. Is it who licenses, a state thing? Or
No,
is it
it's the church.
The church licenses.
Yeah, you go through when I went through, we had to go through 2 years of classes, and then 3 years of classes, and then we were licensed. Now it's like a much longer process.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you're casting, you're doing Agape, but then things start changing. You start getting into you're into this prison work now. So
Yeah.
what was going on?
Well, after I became licensed as a practitioner, I realized there was still something that I needed because the industry was just the politics and the personalities of the industry. Now that I was becoming successful, there was a period in the early 90s where I was one of the top 3 black casting directors, and so I was the first call, one of the first calls, and I that kind of went to my head.
Can I interrupt? So you're saying black. Did you ever get calls for a white movie?
No.
A white? Wow.
No.
Never.
No, I'll tell you, the best pilot I ever got called for was one called Bubba. And I had to cast rednecks. It made me so happy. I loved that pilot. I wanted it to go so bad. So every now and then I would get called for something or somebody would take a chance, but they really had this perception that
So is the industry as segregated now?
Yeah, I think I don't think so, but I don't know for certain because I've been gone a while. However, they just had this wonderful casting meetup in November for all of the people of color, black people that are in casting on any level. And I walked into a room where there were like over 40 women, and it brought me to tears. Because when I was in it, there were 10 of us. We all knew each other across the country. We could count on two hands how many of us there were. And now and then that wasn't all of them. It was the night it was pouring rain, so half of them didn't come. There was like a whole bunch more that had. I was just stunned. Some of them were VPs of casting. In fact, one of my former assistants just became vice president of casting for Columbia Films. And I met her in Atlanta, and she moved up here to be a casting director. So, it's changing in that sense.
What do you think was the reason it really started to change?
I don't know, because it was still, when I was president, I was the first black president of CSA, and I'm using that distinction deliberately, because even though Reuben was part of CSA, Casting Society of America, he never was president or anything like that, but I was the first black president, and that was 2006 to 2008, and that's when I learned that I'm in a very political business. I still hadn't gotten it. After all those years, I still didn't get it. And being on the board of CSA and being the president, I really got how political it was. And so to answer your question, at that point, I still saw the evidence that it was like it had always been, for the most part. But since I've been gone, it seems to have had some shifts. And I don't know what the reason is. But I'm glad that it's happening.
Market value.
What does that mean?
Well, I mean, there's a market. There's a market now for African American black product that was probably there at the time. It just wasn't as discovered by film and movie and television executives.
Could be,
As a revenue. Plus, let's not forget, civil rights never stopped.
No.
Right? It never stopped.
So that's maybe what happened. I know that NBC was challenged by some of the African American community years ago. This whole, Oscar So White, I think that had something to do with it. I think Cheryl, being head of the Academy, had something to do with it, because I know that Robbie got brought on to the Academy while Cheryl was there, whereas none of us were on the Academy up until then. They did not recognize casting directors in general, and specifically the black ones. They didn't feel we had a body of work. But I've seen changes, so I think that probably is very accurate. When that whole movement started, it became apparent that there were not people behind the scenes making decisions, and now it's changing.
Well, you got guys like Eddie Murphy who changed it. Will Smith.
So now you're starting to get involved. Well, tell us more about the prison. What was the transition?
So what I was saying is, when I graduated as a practitioner, I decided to get more training, and I went to University of Santa Monica to get a master's in spiritual psychology, so that I could learn how to be in this industry but not affected by it the way I was. And out of the University of Santa Monica, I got a whole basket of tools. But in the meantime, in 2004, I started volunteering at University of Santa Monica, just like I did at at Agape. So that became my service work in addition to the career stuff. There's always been that balance for me of giving service, paying back, and then doing my work. So 2004, an inmate at a women's prison wrote to University of Santa Monica and said, we read about your school. That's all very nice that you help these rich people to get this, but what about people like us that are lifers with no possibility of parole? These sound like tools we could use. And so the university assigned 2 of their faculty to write a one weekend workshop to go up to that prison in Madera, California and present it. And they took like 10 volunteers with them from the university, graduate alumni group. They went up there and they taught this workshop, and it was so well received that the prison and the inmates asked them to come back again in 6 months, and they have gone every 6 months since. So in 2006, I started going as a volunteer, and it is really the most gratifying work in any venue, any genre I've ever done. I loved it, because I got so much from these women that I was sitting with so intimately, like literally we sit knee to knee and we do these processes together, experiential processes where they learn how to respectfully communicate and how to take personal responsibility and how to avoid conflict and how to begin to honor themselves and the other people around them. This is what we offer them, and this is just like the tip of the iceberg of the trainings. And so I started building my year around going up there every 6 months. And by 2013, we disaffiliated from USM and became our own nonprofit. And the 2 faculty members who were now the founders of this organization asked me to be their first facilitator in training to present the workshop from on stage. And so that's when I went.
You were saying that these people who are in prison for life have to learn communication skills?
Yep.
And I would think that would be like the last thing that they would be thinking about. So how does that happen? I mean, it's a brilliant idea.
Yeah.
But I would just like, was that?
Well, and that was the point. What I've learned over the years is there's a lot of programs that go into prisons. They have everything from yoga to creative writing to you name it. But our process is very specific. We literally sit in what's called trios. 3 people, so the 3 of us would be a trio, and you would be the person that would be sharing. I would be the person walking you through the skill that we're teaching, and he would be observing the 2 of us, right? And then when that segment was over, then we rotate, so everybody gets to sit in each chair. And so the inmates got to sit with us that intimately. We're much closer than we are right now. But they got to, for the first time, rather than people just coming and talking to them from the stage, not only were we sitting down on the gymnasium, on the floor with them, not on the floor, but in chairs, not only were we down there with them, but we were sharing. When we were in the sharer's chair, we talk about real life issues. Like, in my case, my mom had dementia, and I was really struggling with how to manage her care. And so I would go up there and I would talk about that. And the wisdom of these women was such that they would offer me things to consider that were maybe outside my own personal box way of thinking. And I would come back home and implement them, and it would give me relief, So, and that was the experience of all of our volunteers. We go up there and we share our lives with these people, but also we listen to them. So they get 2 things. We share our lives, and also we hear them without any judgment. We don't know what their crime is. One of our guidelines is we never ask, so I never know who I'm sitting with or what they've done unless they volunteer it. And so I don't have a judgment running. We're just 2 people talking. And apparently that dynamic has been the most profound for them. And so they keep coming back. We have people that have been to our workshops since 2004. They don't miss them, because they got such value. And what happened was several of our lifers worked with these skills to the point where they went before the board. They got paroled and they got out. One of them was hired by our organization to be our admin assistant. We have another one that got scholarshiped to USM when they found out she got released. They scholarshiped her for 2 years at University of Santa Monica. And there's so many more out there now. And then in 2013, when we left USM and became our own thing, we got the women's prison that we had been going to in Madeira had been converted to a men's prison. And the women had gotten split up, and some were sent to other women's prisons in Central Valley, some were sent down here in Chino, but we never saw them again, right? So in 2013, we got permission to go into the women's prison down the road from the men's prison now, and we got to see some of our women who had been transferred there, who were promoting our workshop and the value of it. We learned that they would, between our visits, they would take our handouts, they'd call their families, or when they had visits, they'd read the handouts to their family members, they'd practice the tools about respectful communication, they would share what they had learned and how it kept them from getting into fights and getting disciplinaries, you know. I don't have words. I don't have words. And so now, since 2013, we now go to two prisons in Madeira, the women's prison and the men's prison, and then we go to the prison in Chino, which is a women's prison. And the commonality in all three is we bring the workshops to them. They do the work, they practice in between our visits. And the men's prison and the women's prison here in Chino have an additional opportunity because we do weekly Sunday night classes where we take one skill and we just really dive deep into that one skill and practice it for a couple of hours. And so we have and it's all volunteers. I don't know if I've said that, but every one of us that participates, from the facilitators to the people, you know, coming new, that we all pay our own way. We drive ourselves up there. We put ourselves up in hotels. We feed ourselves. And we do this for the love of it. And it's the most profound work I've ever done. And the men's prison was extraordinary the first time we walked in, because all these men had been down for years, and they were the ones that were the self-help leaders in the prison. They were the ones that ran programs and presented and ran the 12 steps and all that stuff. And what they said to us that first day, was that they were so used to ministering to other people, but nobody did that for them until we came. And they are our biggest advocates. They were so impressed by the work we do that after that first visit, they collected among themselves $3,000, and the next time we came, they presented us with this giant check for $3,000, and they said, we're giving you this because we want you to keep coming back.
The prisoners.
The prisoners did this, and
Amazing.
that's why we agreed to have a weekly class. And so we now have volunteers who live in LA that drive up to VSP, 4-hour drive every Sunday to go do the weekly Sunday class. And my husband and I are the co-coordinators of the weekly Sunday class at Chino. So we have a whole team of people that go, you know, in some combination, they go out every Sunday. So like I'm going tonight with some of our other teammates. And we do the 2-hour class. But it all stemmed from this one inmate who is now at Chino with us, who wrote this letter and said, come teach us. Forget them. Come teach us.
So every week it's a different subject matter?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we have two ways of working this. So if it's the big workshop, that's the weekend workshop, it's every 6 months, and we do maybe 4 or 5 processes or skills that we introduce.
And how long are you there for when you're in the prison itself?
So we go Saturday. That's a great question, because I am not a morning person. This is how dedicated I am to this. We get up at 5 in the morning, have breakfast, and we carpool to the prison at 6:30 in the morning. We're there by the time, we have to clear security, and by the time we do all that, we start the workshop about 8 o'clock. We're there until 4, and then we come back to the hotel. And we go back on Sunday and do the same thing.
It's a long day.
It is a long, but you know what, it goes so fast, it's not even funny. And part of what we do is we eat lunch with them. So like, we bring our own food in. We have really simple stuff like, peanut butter, jelly, tuna, salmon packets, that kind of stuff, a lot of snacks and crudité. So we bring our own food in, but we make our little plates and we just go sit with them and we eat with them. And all this stuff was stuff that they had never experienced before. And with the men, they were moved to tears. They were like, you treat us like we're human. You don't treat us like we're animals. And we will not do anything to screw this up.
I would be so afraid to go into a prison. I would. It's just like, it's just scary people. Was that ever anything on your mind?
Not for me personally, and it's funny that you asked that because one of my jobs now, my roles, is I'm the newcomer liaison. So when we have new volunteers, like if you decided you wanted to go, I would be helping train you on what to expect and how to prepare. And so I always open, my training with you may have some feelings coming up around this, so let's talk about that. But I didn't have any apprehension, and I don't know why, because I didn't have anybody that I'd ever known that had been in prison. I'd never been in a jail. I'd never been in any of that. I mean, when I was a kid, my dad, I think, got arrested because he was a civil rights advocate in Central Valley. It's funny how things come all the way back around. Because Madera is just above Fresno, where I lived. But I think he got arrested, but the charges were dropped. But he was like, we used to boycott after school. You know what I mean? That's what my life looked like in junior high school. I'd go boycott something and picket something. So my dad and his friends, I think, got arrested, but I never saw a jail. I didn't know anybody that was in jail. But I wasn't apprehensive. I just kind of walked in there like, okay. And I think it's partially because of what it looks like. It's not like Oz. The prisons that we go to look like California high schools with barbed wire. They look like beautiful campuses. They're all one level, and they have the gun tower and the guys with the guns looking down at you.
So this is maximum security, right?
No, it's these are like the men's prison at VSP was a level 2 security, which means that they had been down a long time. They had special needs, like they were former gang members that had gotten out, or they were law enforcement. So that's kind of the population we met with that first men's prison. But the women's prison is like the one that's in Madera. If I understand correctly, they're like a 4. I think there's actually people on death row, but we never meet those people. They don't come to our workshop. You have to earn the right to come to the workshops, which means the common denominator on all 3 of these prisons is you can't be acting out and then come to our workshop. You have to have a certain level of disciplinary, cooperation, to be able to get the privilege of coming. And so they work for it. We're going to the men's prison this weekend, and we're doing an advanced workshop, which means everyone that's coming to the workshop is someone who is either in that Sunday weekly class or who has done at least one of our big weekend workshops before. So it's all we call them mentors, because that's how they serve in the prison. They mentor the people that are coming new. So we're doing an all mentors workshop this weekend. We're expecting 200 people of the participants, and there are 90 of us volunteers going up.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's quite the organization.
That's
It's
huge.
so organized.
And you created this?
No, I didn't create it. The founders created it. But as a facilitator, when I became a facilitator, I took on 2 responsibilities. I'm the newcomer liaison, so I train new volunteers on how to come in with us. And then the other piece is that I'm the coordinator of we call it ILTAG, which means it's a mentor support group. The weekly Sunday class, I'm coordinator of that one in Chino. So I organize the team, help them get through the application process. I do all that, but those are my 2 areas of responsibility. And then I facilitate the big workshops now with the founders. And the goal is that, like, ultimately Stan and I would be co-facilitating the workshop ourselves while the founders went to one of the other prisons. That's their intention. So they're building a leadership team of facilitators that can just handle the whole workshop for the weekend while they go do other stuff, because they've been doing it since 2004.
Have you officially stopped doing casting?
Yeah, I retired in 2013 officially. Yeah, because when my mom got sick, I really couldn't work, so I did a couple of low-budget films and things like that. But in 2013, I had a producer that I had done a lot of freebie and low-budget stuff for, who got a big film that I will not name. And I found out about it through one of my assistants calling and saying, "Do you know that she's getting ready to hire a casting director?" And I was like, "What?" And I called her and I said, our deal was, if you ever get a big movie, I'm first call. And she went, "Well, but my partner wants to know what you've done recently, and your last film hadn't been since 2010, so we wanted somebody more current." And I thought, I'm done. That's it. I'm out.
Welcome to Hollywood.
Yeah.
I'm out. And that was a black person. So, you know what I mean? It was like, I'm done.
I be in the business and deal with the business.
Yeah.
It's tough.
I used to say to people, I would rather go to the prisons than deal with Hollywood. I feel safer. So what's next is that I'm going to continue to work with the prisons. That has become my passion work, and I've gone from actors to inmates. And it makes me very happy. I have such respect for you said you would be terrified, but we go in such a safe way, and we're so, protected and supported by the staff. They really respect what we do. They saw the evidence of it all those years we were at the first women's prison, that I just never am afraid. I've sat with people who looked scary to me, both in the men and the women's prisons, and then by the end of our trio, they're crying. And they'll often tell us, we don't get to do this anyplace else. We can't be this vulnerable. It could cost us our lives. They confess their crimes. They talk about things that they, how they're held in the prison. I mean, it has been for me. When I talk to the newcomers, what I tell them is the fundamental skill that we work with as a team is that, first of all, we are of one accord. We go in there of one accord, and our intention is to see each person that we encounter as a person who made a choice, and this is the result. But I don't have to have an opinion about it, and I don't have to judge it. I just go in there with compassion and with acceptance and understanding. The way I would language it is, I lead with my loving. And so that they feel that. And so if you're a hardened inmate who has been used to people looking at you as a number, has been used to people having the same reaction that you just described about how you'd feel as somebody to be terrified of, and you sit down with a man or a woman who's simply saying, tell me your story. Let me tell you so we always start, just so you know, in our processes, the volunteers always start by sharing first. We don't ask them to do that. We share first. And when we are authentic and we're transparent, they feel that. They can't help but feel it. And that's why we rotate, so everybody gets a chance to be in every chair. And so to answer your question, I think that it's our compassion, our loving nature. We really come there with an intention to just be present with them and to listen with our hearts. And I'm not saying that as rhetoric. It's like really just seeing them as a person that has something to share in that moment. They feel it, and it matters to them, and they carry it for 6 months until we're back.
So the ones you go to every week, do you see the same people?
Yeah, the mentor support class is people have to sign up, and
Prisoners.
The prisoners. Yeah, we try not to call them inmates as a rule. We call them the participants or the mentors. Okay. So this is a mentor-only class, which means that they have to have done the big workshop before they can take this weekly class, and that's at both the prisons. That's the qualifier. So the people that sign up, we see like 40 people a week. And it's the same 40 people. So we have a group A and a group B, but it's the same 40 people in group A, same in group B. And we teach each group the same skill, and then we move to another skill.
And they go from that to back into the population and hopefully mentor people.
Exactly. That's their charge. We call them, once they have graduated from our weekly class, we actually give them a special name tag that says mentor leader. And their job is to share what they've learned, but more importantly, to model what they've learned. It's like I tell them, it's fine for you to sit in class where it's, just all of us.
Yeah.
But when you go out there and somebody pisses you off, that's the time for you to take the pause. That's the time for you to use respectful communication. That's the time for you to really listen to that person versus reacting to them.
But do they share with other inmates while they're in prison still?
They go back in their dorms. I'm told that some dorms have done like trios where they teach the other people that haven't been to our workshops how to do trios before they get there, and then they drag them to the big workshop. It's amazing. It's amazing. And I'm not saying it's not saying it works for everybody.
Sounds gratifying for you.
Some people it works for, and some of them, we don't see again. But we don't go there with an expectation. We have a team affirmation, which is, we are so flexible. Now, if you can imagine 90 people yelling that, And we've taught the participants to do that. It's like in our workshop, we'll tell them right up top, this is our team affirmation. So when stuff happens, we are so flexible. And so I've used it in every part of my life. Stan and I were in Egypt on a trip on a bus with 40 people, and I taught them to say it because we never knew what was going to happen. It's like, okay, everybody, we are so flexible. I have just in the last year realized I've had an incredible arc in my life, and several acts, and that I'm really coming to appreciate that. And there's things that I've said to you guys that I don't even think my son knows. I love the work I do. I loved being a casting director. I loved it. Every second of it. I did not love the politics.
Right.
I did not love the preconceived ideas and the limitations, but I loved auditioning actors. I loved supporting actors and empowering them and giving them a safe container for 5 minutes to be in my room and know that they were seen and heard in that moment, no matter whether they were right for it or not. I loved that whole part. And I love working with the inmates and
it sounds like that's a theme in your life, is giving people that one-to-one and listening to them and making them feel like that moment is an important moment.
That's true. I hadn't thought about it that way, but it's true. That is the through line.
Yeah.
And that's the legacy that I feel like I was given by my family, Not because they necessarily did it, but because I learned how important it was.